All right, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar by the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies Housing Initiative. My name is Shane Phillips. I manage the Housing Initiative here at the Lewis Center, and we are going to be discussing the center's research on the implementation of fair housing laws in California, and also how our experience here in California may inform some federal rulemaking around its own fair housing requirements. Happy voting day to all who celebrate, which I hope is everyone here. It's a fairly small group today, so we really welcome your questions to get some direct kind of one-on-one answers as we get to the Q&A at the end here. Just so folks are aware, there's some technical language that will be involved in this webinar. There's a phrase we will use regularly today, affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. Just so we're all on the same page about what that means, this phrase comes from the Fair Housing Act, which was passed by Congress in 1968. The Fair Housing Act is best known for prohibiting discrimination in the housing market, but it also says that the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and recipients of its funding, which is just about every jurisdiction in the country, must do more than simply not discriminate. They must take meaningful actions to overcome racial segregation, patterns of segregation, and foster inclusive communities. In other words, racial segregation was institutionalized by decades of past federal and local policy, as well as private actions, and non-discrimination alone would not be enough to end segregation in the future. Making those policies and acts illegal might keep segregation from getting worse, maybe, but it would take intentional, proactive, affirmative interventions to actually reverse those patterns of exclusion and undo the harms that they caused. Our focus today will be on a tool the Lewis Center has developed with our partners at UC Davis and Berkeley called the Fair Housing Land Use Score, or FLUS. The tool allows policymakers, planners, advocates, and others to see how good of a job cities are doing at planning for more housing and affordable housing in particular in higher income, higher opportunity, often historically exclusionary neighborhoods and cities. It can score cities over time, looking at past and present housing plans to see if they're improving or regressing, and it can compare different cities to each other. In the chat, I'm going to provide a couple links, one to the full article that we published on the FLUS in the Journal of American Planning Association, and then a shorter 2-page brief about it. Send this to everyone here. Those are 2 separate links. The tool actually can also be used to evaluate specific rezoning proposals, which our colleague Aaron Baral did for the city of Los Angeles just recently. And Aaron and I published an op-ed in the LA Times just yesterday sharing our findings. And we'll share a link to that as well. So before moving on, I want to make sure that we give thanks to 2 funders who have made this research possible. First is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which supported our early research on implementation of California's version of AFFH in 8 case study cities. And second is the Wells Fargo Foundation, which has allowed us to scale up this analysis and get scores for more than 200 cities with more to come. This work would not have been possible without them, and so we're very grateful for their support. To give a quick outline of this webinar, we're going to kick things off with a presentation on the Fair Housing Land Use Score and findings from this research by Paavo Monkkonen, professor of urban planning at UCLA, but currently about 6,000 miles and 9 hours away in Lyon, France. We'll then have a conversation and some Q&A, at which time we will invite Kevin Kane, who is program manager for demographics and growth vision at the Southern California Association of Governments. Demographics and growth vision, Kevin, is a very futuristic title, so congrats on that. And we'll also have Azim Khan Malik, the executive director of Abundant Housing Los Angeles, who is going to join Kevin and Paavo, and they're all going to share their own thoughts on the challenges and opportunities presented by affirmatively furthering fair housing and on the potential uses of the Fair Housing Land Use Score. We'll also invite questions from the audience, as I mentioned, for the last 10 or 15 minutes or so. So with all of that said, I will hand it over to Paavo for the next part of the webinar to give a presentation. So Paavo, take it away.
Cool. Thank you, Shane. It's great to see all these familiar names and unfamiliar names in the participant list. Good evening from France. I'm excited to talk to you about this research we've been doing and to kind of bring up the broader topic of how to make progress on this very important and large task of affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'm going to be talking about a fairly technical and acronym-laden part of this broad policy arena. But I think, to kind of set the big picture perspective, it's an area where we're so far from achieving the goals of fair housing. If we understand kind of racial disparities and socioeconomic inequality in the broader economy and in housing in particular, kind of in an abstract way from numbers, but once you start digging into maps and looking at kind of where subsidized housing is being built and where it's absolutely not being built, and then you read the news about the latest developments in the city of Los Angeles with respect to the planning process. It's a bit disheartening, but it's also, encouraging that people are paying more attention to this, and we have this legal tool through the AFFH law now in California that we can use to make it a reality. If you think about the discussions about the right to housing, for example, I'm in France where they have the right to housing, but it's really in the details of implementation then that right gets manifest. So I think this, it's a technical wonky thing. Bear with me on that. If you want to kind of ignore some of the more detailed parts, I'll show you some cool maps, but definitely come back for the discussion with advocates leader Shane Azine and another technocrat, Kevin. All right, I'm going to share my screen and kick off this slideshow. Can y'all see my screen there?
Yes, we can.
Great. So Shane gave a great overview abstract to this talk. I'll cover a little bit of that, and then I'll talk about measurement in particular in this area and why it's necessary. And then I'll go through the simple overview of how we calculate this score and start getting you thinking about what other things we might use it for and how advocates might use it in their work. And then I guess the most fun part will be some maps. So I got some good cities, some bad cities, and some okay cities. Maybe an ugly one. I don't know. You'll tell me whether that's the case. So as Shane mentioned, AFFH is this component of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was a really important law in that it asked, as Shane mentioned, jurisdictions, federal grantees, which are all local governments, to take affirmative steps to undo the legacy of segregation, right? So this law was passed near the end of the civil rights movement after so many achievements had been made, but at a time when the country was really facing extreme inequality in its cities, and the Kerner Commission had identified segregation as kind of this apartheid situation in the country and really the core problem. So the idea of the law was to undo that segregation through affirmative steps, but it was never really implemented, right? Until 2015, at the end of the Obama administration, the final rule took this decentralized approach to implementing the fair housing, the affirmatively furthering fair housing component of the law, right? And so that decentralized approach asks local governments to analyze fair housing problems and come up with a set of meaningful actions to address those problems. Notably, the federal guidance doesn't emphasize land use regulation, which is kind of surprising given what we know now about the importance of land use regulation in creating housing segregation, which in turn creates socioeconomic and racial segregation. I saw Anne Owen's name in the participant list. I highly recommend her paper on housing segregation and people segregation, because it's kind of a core assumption that we rely on when we're doing our land use reform research and advocacy, but it is really true that at the bottom is the land use regulation. On top of that, housing is built, and then people inhabit those houses. And so undoing the segregated patterns of land use rules is really a first step in achieving this larger goal, and it's a necessary but insufficient step, right? So we could achieve this goal of integrated and balanced neighborhoods through a number of different ways, but it would be probably impossible to do that without also removing housing segregation by reforming land use rules. So it's weak at the federal level in terms of the land use side and implementing the AFFH rule, but after Trump rolled back the rule, California adopted its own state AFH law, which presented a great opportunity, right? Because California had this existing system of housing element planning, which required local governments to select sites where housing would be developed to meet growth targets. But now they're being asked also to select those sites for new housing development, including low-income housing development, with a lens of fair housing, right? So what does that mean? You know, HCD released guidance a little bit too late to have a dramatic impact, perhaps, on this round of housing element updates. But you know, in that guidance, they do say that sites that cities are selecting to include for new housing in their housing element sites inventory should further the goals of fair housing and shouldn't be concentrated in low-income neighborhoods. So how will the state agency that reviews housing plans know whether jurisdictions are complying with the law, right? Is a jurisdiction's plan to develop new housing meeting the goal of fair housing by not concentrating that housing in lower income neighborhoods? Well, they gave some guidance on how to do this. Very few jurisdictions followed it to the letter, or even a very good job. Basically, they asked cities and counties to assess what percent of the planned new housing for low-income households was located in the census tracts that make up the lower half of the city, right? So are they putting all of, you know, if they're putting 80% of the units for low-income households, or the, you know, the plans for those units in the lower income half of the city, right? That's an obvious problem. And so that was a good kind of rough measure, but it was inaccurate in several ways and fairly imprecise. You know, some cities put almost all of their sites. We found one city that put the vast majority of its sites for low-income housing right at the middle, right? So it seemed like it was doing a good job when in fact it was not. And so for that reason, we developed the Fair Housing Land Use Score to provide a precise measure of where cities are planning to build housing, especially low-income housing. So that's what it is. It's an index that measures how land use policies relate to neighborhood opportunity. It basically measures kind of where housing is located, or where sites for new housing is located relative to an underlying neighborhood variable. We use income for this paper that we published, but we can do it for other neighborhood variables like pollution score, or transit access, or racial ethnic homogeneity, right? And it creates a number between -1 and 1 that tells you, are the sites for new housing, or are the housing units themselves located disproportionately in the lower income neighborhoods, or disproportionately in the higher income neighborhoods, or spread across neighborhoods evenly. And like I said, it's, you know, it's flexible with respect to the neighborhood variable that we use. It's also flexible with respect to the different units of geography. So we can do it for tracts or blocks or even cities within a region. You know, you can use it. We're specifically focused on land use reform, but you know, another big component of fair housing policy should be investment in lower income neighborhoods. And so you could also use the same score to track whether cities are investing more disproportionate amounts of public money in their lower income neighborhoods to bring up the quality of infrastructure, for example, or even policing. You know, you could use it to measure to what extent police dollars are being spent disproportionately in certain types of neighborhoods. So just to give you a sense of how it works, here are two hypothetical plans for affordable housing, using the city of Santa Monica as a background. These aren't the plans for the city of Santa Monica, although the plan for the city of Santa Monica is not good, as we show in our paper. You can see Plan A, right? So the color of the different neighborhoods indicates its neighborhood income, the median income, right? So darker blue neighborhoods are higher income, north of Montana, and light blue neighborhoods are lower income. And you can see the red dots are planned sites for low income housing, for example. And so you can see that Plan A, most of the sites are in lower income neighborhoods, and Plan B, most of the sites are in higher income neighborhoods. And so, you know, our FLUS will tell us how bad Plan B is and how bad Plan A is and how good Plan B is. You could also use this very simple metric of what percent of sites are located in the lower income half of the city. And for these plans where the difference is very dramatic, that simple kind of what percent is in the lower income half of the city would be fine. But once you get to plans that are a bit less obviously good or bad, that changes. Okay, so the way it works is you divide the city's neighborhoods, you rank the city's neighborhoods by that variable, in this case, income, but you could rank them by different other neighborhoods, other variables, sorry. And so these graphs translate these maps into a graph that we can then calculate our measure using, right? So they show you what percent of the city's land area is in these different kinds of neighborhoods and what percent of the city's sites allocated for affordable housing are in these different neighborhoods, right? So you can see that Plan A, roughly 35% of the land area is in the lower income neighborhood, and 70% of the sites for low income housing are in those lower income neighborhoods, right? And so tells you kind of, we use land area. You could use different denominators in this sense to normalize the size of tracts or the size of neighborhoods. You could use the number of people, but the problem with that is often lower density neighborhoods or the number of housing units, which is what a lot of cities did in their housing element when they tried to do this. But lower density neighborhoods tend to be higher income. And so it kind of skews what you would want to have in an ideal calculation. So we use the percent of land area located in those neighborhoods. So then this shows us, the top row of graphs shows us basically instead of 3 neighborhoods, now we have 10 or so distributed from lowest income to highest income, right? And we can see those blue lines along the top row are showing us what percent of the land area is in that neighborhood. And the red line is showing us what percent of the housing units are in that neighborhood. Then the graphs below it, we track the cumulative share of the city's land area and the cumulative share of the city's sites for lower income housing, right? And so we create these continuous lines that go from none of the city's land and none of the city's housing all the way to all of it. And if you've seen this thing called the Gini coefficient before, you might start to think where this is going, because the Gini coefficient is the classic measure of income inequality. And that's what our math for this measure is, for the FLUS, is based on, right? So the Gini coefficient, if you rank people from poorest to richest, and you have an even distribution of income, that your cumulative income would just go in a straight line from poorest to richest, and then you look at the actual distribution of income, and oftentimes the lower income parts of the population have much less of the total income or total wealth, and you get this real curve, and then you calculate the difference between the real distribution of income and the even distribution of income, and that tells you how unequal a society is. In the same way, we look at kind of the distribution of land and the distribution of affordable housing sites to see how unequally it's distributed. The difference here is it can be unequally distributed on the lower income side or the higher income side of neighborhoods. And so you see on the left, right, this is the disproportionately putting sites in lower income neighborhoods, and on the right, this is disproportionately putting sites in the higher income neighborhoods. And then the number itself is just the area of the difference between these two lines. So, if you want us to calculate, if you're an advocate and you want us to calculate, or a local government official, you want us to calculate this for your city, we'd be happy to do that. It's not actually that complicated. You can do it in Excel once you have the data, right? So you need the number of planned units in a census tract, you need the size of the census tract, then you just rank them, you calculate this cumulative percents, and then there's a formula that you use to calculate the difference between those two lines. Straightforward. Okay, so onto some maps and some good, bad, and okay. We have 2 positive scores. If we've calculated, Aaron and mostly has calculated scores for over 150 cities in the state, right? We're waiting for cities to have a compliant housing element before calculating the score using their sites inventory data. And something like 80% are negative, or 75% are negative, which is not surprising if you think about how land use happens in California. And if you think that most cities are citing multifamily parcels near existing multifamily parcels, right? Most housing element sites inventories are not rezoning dramatically. And as a result, they're just going on an inertia kind of where have they had multifamily sites before, or along commercial corridors, or converting commercial to multifamily, or using some larger parcels. And so, we reveal using the site score that most cities are disproportionately citing affordable housing parcels in lower income parts of those cities, but not all of them, right? So we have Montebello and Carson have positive scores. I'll show you some negative scores that are the more typical kind, and then some near zero scores. So here's Montebello. Its score is a 0.25, right? I think I mentioned -1 is the worst score you can have, 1 is the best score you can have, and 0 means you're distributing your sites for affordable housing across the city pretty evenly. So on the left here, we have a map of Montebello. Darker green is higher income, lighter green is lower income. And we can see that there's a cluster of sites in the middle of the city that are kind of in the medium and lower income neighborhoods. But then at the north of the city, there's some sites that are a bit larger in the higher income neighborhoods. And so we look at the graph on the right and how the cumulative area of those tracks, you can see that they're different by those black dots on the blue line, and then the red line shows us where the sites for low income housing are in a cumulative sense. And then that difference between the blue line and the red line in this case is 0.25, tells us what their score is. So Montebello did well. They also had good AFFH programs that we analyzed in a separate paper. City of Carson, again, on the left, you see the map where you can see a number of sites located in the medium to higher income neighborhoods of the city, although there is that cluster again in the middle in the lower income neighborhoods. And so you can see, you can start to understand maybe these graphs on the right-hand side, that jump of the red line from 0 to 10% of the cumulative area, where it jumps from 0 to 20% of the housing element sites. That's those blue dots in the lowest income neighborhood of the city, or the fairly low income neighborhood city in the middle. And then there are no sites from in the kind of these lower a bit above the lowest lower income neighborhoods, and then sites near the end in the highest income neighborhoods. Okay, so on to the bad. These are more typical of what the maps and the FLUS graphs look like. You can see Glendale here. A lot of the sites, if you look in the lowest 25% income neighborhoods of the city, we see 70, nearly 80% of the sites for housing, right, in their plan, right? And then after that, from the 25th percentile of income neighborhood to the 100th, there's only 20% more of the sites, right? So this is -0.6 is clearly disproportionately planning sites for new housing in lower income parts of the city. It seems like it doesn't advance AFFH goals. And we could talk in the discussion about kind of, are these the place, the arguments about, well, maybe they have better transit access or closer to jobs, but also maybe they are more polluted and have less amenities, like those big green swaths of the hills. Okay, Richmond, California, up in the Bay, also has a fairly negative score, -0.5. You can see the graph on the left. A lot of sites in the middle part of the city, which is lower income. And if you look at this graph on the right, you can get a number like the lowest 25% income neighborhoods have 50% of the sites, for example, using that red line that tells us the cumulative distribution of sites. Okay, Riverside, also fairly bad, but maybe less bad than Glendale, -0.45, right? So the lowest 25% income of the city's neighborhoods has over half the sites. Okay, and then there are a number of cities where they're just kind of a bit more outlier cities where it's pretty evenly distributed across the neighborhoods and has a near zero FLUS. So Chino Hills and El Monte. And these cities kind of raise the question of, what should be the expectations? Let's say HCD was going to implement this, or HUD was going to implement this as part of AFFH review. Should they be expecting cities to have a positive score where they're disproportionately citing planned low-income housing developments in higher income neighborhoods, or is an even distribution good enough, right? For discussion. Just to throw out Los Angeles, Shane mentioned their great op-ed about the changes in the rezoning plans. LA didn't do well on the FLUS, negative 0.4. And what's especially concerning is that, we went through the different rezoning programs. Aaron Baral did this through the different rezoning programs to see what the FLUS score would be for each of those different programs, right? And so we can see that the faith-based organization rezonings, for example, are located in lower income parts of the city, whereas the affordable housing overlay would have disproportionately created space for new housing in the higher income parts of the city. And we can see that, the TOC expansion as well is as a positive plus, which makes it especially concerning that these are the ones that are probably not going to go forward. So I think this shows us kind of the utility of the FLUS for advocates, at least. But hopefully we would see state and federal agencies adopting it as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking there. I probably went on too long. I'm just going to end by saying, there's some issues we could talk about. It's, in terms of its effectiveness, this isn't like an absolute metric. All measurement, should be taken with some caution when being used as a policy tool, of course. And there are questions, of course, about how else to use it. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing and open it up for the discussion.
Thanks, Pablo. I actually did want to ask a clarifying question. You put it on that last slide, but earlier you had said something about how essentially a 1 would be an optimal score. But can you say more about that? I think you, from that last slide, indicated that's not quite true, and maybe there's downsides to putting all of the affordable housing or housing capacity in exclusively high income neighborhoods. Could you just say a bit about that?
That's a great question. And I think so it comes to one of the critiques that often comes up, which is people maybe misinterpret this way we've been using the FLUS to mean that this is where affordable housing will be built. So in this case, we've been using it to date to talk about zoning for affordable housing and where cities are allowing affordable housing to be built. So if it's true, if the only place in the city that had multifamily zoning was the one high income neighborhood, that would probably be a bad idea, right? The fact of the matter, though, is that right now, most multifamily zoning is located in lower income parts of cities. And most higher income neighborhoods don't allow any multifamily and therefore subsidized housing to be built in them, right? And so what we're talking about is more of a course correction in that sense. And so kind of by having a new, if we're talking about in this case, sites for new housing that the city has selected where housing is developable and they're putting them disproportionately in higher income neighborhoods, there already is multifamily zoning available in the lower income neighborhoods. So this is kind of creating new opportunities rather than this is the only place we're building it. And so we're not talking about where housing should be built necessarily, but where it should be allowed to be built.
Got it. Yeah, and I think if you are trying to reverse patterns of segregation to kind of push back against the past that we've established, you probably need a positive score, a significantly positive score. Otherwise, you're kind of just maintaining things as they are.
It seems like that's the case.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to bring in Kevin and Azine. Welcome, gentlemen. Kevin, I'm going to actually ask each of you a question in turn, and that will be sort of an opportunity for you to say a little bit about your work as well, but I'll give you something specific to work with. So, Kevin, I'm going to start with you. You've been working on the preliminary growth forecast and allocation for Connect SoCal 2024, which you can say a bit about, but this is essentially a vision for how and where the region will grow through 2050. I'm curious to hear about what that forecast looks like at this stage and how these considerations about affirmatively furthering fair housing factor into it.
Certainly, Shane. And first of all, thanks for having me here. Like you mentioned, I'm program manager for demographics and growth vision at Southern California Association of Governments. We've got I'd say a fairly large statutory role in the regional housing needs allocation process that comes up every 8 years. And that's really where you saw AFFH becoming a real piece. The 2017-2018 legislative packages that Pablo mentioned, put this into our, not only the local site selection process, but also the region level process for allocating housing needs across the various cities and counties of Southern California. And statewide, but here we're focusing on Southern California. 48% of the state, feel fairly comfortable with that bit of focus here. Now, the RENA, which is the main mechanism for, kind of ensuring that local jurisdictions zone for kind of their fair share of housing need, howsoever defined, has had a close but somewhat odd relationship with regional planning and regional transportation planning. So every 8 years we do a RENA. Every 4 years we do an RTP-SCS, a Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy. And the practice for a long time had been that you generate a growth forecast, which is principally based on US Clean Air Act requirements that you forecast what growth is going to look like in the region at a very small area so that you can model it, so that you can have policies surrounding it in the abstract. And then you use that forecast that was heavily driven by a project basis. Does a local jurisdiction have development entitlement agreements, and are they building a new community here or there, or are they transitioning some land use in some other parts of the town, maybe downtown revitalization, for example? And they would take that and give that back to the regional government authority, us, and we would basically integrate that into a regional plan. And what that generally did was it allowed jurisdictions to not necessarily have to look to transformational planning to accommodate a share of regional housing needs. It was not very infill oriented. Typically, it was very fringe oriented, and it was very project based rather than kind of socioeconomic need based. So I think that expectation's really been turned on its head following the last cycle of the regional housing needs assessment, where Southern California in particular got roughly triple the housing need to plan for, which was a great outcome, I would say, in a lot of ways for for the targets and even some of the maps that Pablo shared earlier. But we have to realize that this is kind of an ongoing and iterative process. The next regional housing needs is not going to be based exclusively on the growth forecast from a regional transportation plan. That being said, when you have a housing need number of 1.3 million across the region, and then you distribute that into local jurisdictions, and then you tell local jurisdictions to find sites, update their zoning codes, potentially even update their general plans, you're going to have a lot more potential land supply in the specific areas. You saw a lot more supply open up, say, South Pasadena as an example of one jurisdiction that, had it not been for the regional housing needs process, probably would not have had a lot of additional sites that they would have to open up. And I'm not talking specifically about which types of neighborhoods they're in. But this is really the kind of the thing that we're trying to take into account here, is that you have this supply opening up, presumably in more accessible areas, less environmentally hazardous areas by and large, and as a corollary, in more areas that can promote reduced segregation region wide to a certain degree. It's a multi-objective problem, a lot of statutory and other objectives to take into account. But the hope is that our next growth forecast process takes this into account a little bit more intentionally. And then when that feeds into the next regional housing needs allocation process, that in turn is going to be taken into account a little bit more intentionally.
Thanks, Kevin. Azine, I noticed you also have a great mustache. We were talking about this before you joined us a few minutes before, so good to have you. A sort of related question: Abundant Housing advocates on housing issues all over the county, maybe even beyond LA County in some cases. A few years ago, AHLA was pushing for SCAG actually to allocate a larger share of housing to higher income coastal cities. And more recently, you've been working on reaching out to cities as they updated their housing elements and pushing them to do more in many cases. It seems like maybe a logical next step for your advocacy might be on the implementation of the zoning reforms that were outlined in those housing elements. So I'm curious from you to hear what your plans are there, if any, and what you feel like you need to succeed, or even how you might define success on these next steps.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Shane, and good morning, everyone. I'm Azim Khan Malik. I'm the Executive Director of Abundant Housing LA. And thanks for having me here. So yeah, that's a great question. And so indeed, I think one of the places that we're going to be focusing a lot of our work in 2024, especially, um, is on the implementation of the required rezonings that a lot of our sixth cycle housing elements are requiring. Obviously in LA County, a lot of our local work is mostly focused on LA County. Especially, LA City is certainly the big boy in that regard and in the county, but there are uh, 87 other municipalities plus the unincorporated county um, in our region. So that's a lot of where we will be, focusing our time and attention to make sure that those required rezonings are as equitable as possible. And as we've been talking about, affirmatively further fair housing and reach that goal of trying to desegregate our neighborhoods via our land use plans. And so, I think that one of the things that especially caught, our eye as an advocacy organization um, about a tool like the Plus, right? Fair land use. Um, I know the acronym, but I couldn't spell it out for you.
I was
Um,
wondering as I was preparing for this, actually, we call it FLUS. But Rena also has an H and it's kind of pronounced like a double E or an I. So I don't know if it's Felis, but who knows? We'll go with FLUS for now.
Plus, there you go. Um, but yeah, so as an advocacy organization, oftentimes, there are some things that you kind of anecdotally know are not right, right? Like if we're, talking about, the city of Los Angeles and its upcoming, citywide housing incentive program or required rezonings, kind of, the big news there has been the city shifting away, from being as aggressive as it can be on rezoning single family neighborhoods, from in a certain respect, it can be a math puzzle, right? You have to rezone for a certain number of units, and 50% of those rezonings have to be on residentially zoned land. So, you know, can you fit this puzzle together in a way that is legal? The city has a lot of great, smart people working there, and I'm sure they'll figure out something that is, legally viable. But uh, is it the morally and ethically right thing to do, or is it the thing that's going to produce the best outcomes, socially desirable outcomes? Probably not, right? But then the question then becomes, how do you quantify that? And I think that's one of the most exciting things about a tool like this is kind of pushes us in the direction of being able to quantify, like, okay, taking X, Y, or Z policy lever off the table means we're actually reducing, the amount of housing by X, Y, or Z metric in these highest or high opportunity areas. So, the um, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying that certainly a big area of focus for us in 2024 is going to be the required rezonings that our sixth cycle housing elements have required of a lot of our municipalities. And it's tools like this that make us able to bring some kind of cohesion to the conversation.
Thanks, Tazeen. I think this question can maybe go to everyone, but maybe start with Pavo. One critique someone could make of the Fair Housing Land Use Score is that by focusing on the distribution of affordable housing sites or just multifamily zoning by neighborhood income, we are missing on other important considerations for where we build housing. And you did talk a little bit about this. Neighborhoods with high incomes probably overlap with those that have relatively low levels of air and noise pollution and good schools, but they might not always be the places with lots of jobs or quality transit. And I think on the one hand, we certainly want more housing in communities, at least in the city of LA, like Brentwood and Encino. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily a bad thing to build more homes in Koreatown or Hollywood either, where, at least on one metric, transit service connects you to a lot of parts of the region. We also have a lot of policies at the state and federal level that push us to subsidize affordable housing in lower income communities rather than higher income ones. And there are some good reasons for that. And so, what do you all think about the balance between these different planning priorities and how they relate to to this score? And again, Pavo, I'll start with you for that question.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I would just say sort of what I said earlier, where we focused to date on the zoning rather than the production of housing itself, right? So if if we were in France and we had a powerful public sector that could just go build some social housing, then I would say maybe don't build it in Rancho Palos Verdes, far from bus lines and amenities and shops, right? But we're talking about California, where our public sector just sets the table, if you will, and then our affordable housing developers are the ones to choose where to build, right? And so I think requiring higher income neighborhoods to open up land for multifamily housing isn't going to harm anybody. You know, if the affordable housing developers don't build there, they don't build there. I will. I'm curious to hear what Kevin and Azine think about that, and then I will also add a question, if I may, because another critique sort of that came up in the review process for this paper was, you know, if you think about affluent cities like Santa Monica or shouldn't it be enough that they allow housing to be built anywhere, given that even their lowest income neighborhoods are higher income than and higher opportunity than most of the region. And so why should we hold them to the same standard as we hold the city of LA, where, there's so much more diversity across neighborhoods?
I'll say that I was pretty impressed by the measure. I think it adds a lot of nice elements. It's a continuous measure. You're not going to engineer a cliff by, I think you mentioned that HCD's prior standard just asked you to put lower income sites in higher income neighborhoods and vice versa. But that just kind of has an arbitrary 50% threshold on either side. This is nice and continuous and has a lot of good features here. While I think it's an improved measure, I still think there are a few additional technical improvements that could be made. Why not use block groups plus a buffer or an ego hood or something in that regard? I'm a little bit concerned about the use of land area as the denominator exclusively. So a few maybe little refinements, but by and large, it's a measure of one piece of AFFH, and it's a measure of one very small piece of the objective of land use planning. And I don't know that it's wholly sufficient to look at plus scores and say something like, land use policies in these three cities exacerbated segregation rather than worked against it. I think that's much too strong of a claim than to be supported by this individual measure. And let me explain why. For example, in Santa Monica, during the fifth cycle of RENA, Santa Monica was asked to accommodate 1,700 sites. During the sixth cycle of RENA, they were asked to accommodate 8,900 sites, 5 times more. In fact, their lower income component was 6.5 times more. So I would suggest, that this is certainly one tool that can help understand the distribution of sites across a jurisdiction, with some exceptions. It's not going to work in the city of Bradbury, which has a population of 921 and is made up of a single census block group, of course. But it's one tool, but it's not going to tell the entire picture, especially when you have such a vastly different picture between, say, fifth and sixth cycle RENA, for example.
I do think that I think that's a great question that you ask and pose to all of us, Shane, and because this is something we do a lot of thinking about. And I think it's important to, contextualize the way we, really center, AFFH and our goals of, desegregating our communities, which is to say that, uh, we ought to build housing in Hollywood and Koreatown and Silver Lake and Echo Park. And I think, a big part of the problem is that we've only been building housing in those neighborhoods, right? And by driving development pressure to the areas that have the biggest concentration of multifamily zoned capacity, right, we are also driving gentrification and driving displacement. And so the real key here is opening up more communities to allow more housing to be built in all kinds of places to ease the pressure that drives so much displacement, in communities of color. And I will say to go along with that, uh, as you were saying, Pavel, a lot of times our public sector kind of, sets the table. And so, we set the table, so to speak, with, some base zoning and land use policies. But I do think it's important to kind of go one step beyond that, right? And ask, okay, well, we are maybe now moving to open up more land for multifamily housing in different neighborhoods, but what's it actually going to take to get housing built in those neighborhoods, right? So, there is a reason that most housing in general, for that matter, but a lot of subsidized housing that's, paid for with public capital subsidies or public operating subsidies are in lower resource areas, right? Land costs are less, and so it's cheaper to develop there, especially when you're operating on the tight margins that a lot of nonprofit housing developers are, right? And so, in a lot of high resource neighborhoods, we do need to think more critically and strategically, right? And um, advance things like affordable housing overlay zones that really take that development incentive, that density incentive, that next step, right, to um, kind of make that the higher land cost pencil, right? TOC has been extremely successful in this regard, right, at making it worth it for folks to build multifamily housing in more expensive areas with uh, um, with inclusionary units, with lower income units, especially a lot of the times targeting those units, units that target those with the lowest incomes, extremely low income, very low income. So there is that a piece of the puzzle, which I think it's important that we not lose sight of as well.
Thank you. We have about 11 minutes left already. We're running to the end. Again, if you have a question, send it to the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to it at the end here. I did want to kind of affirm something Kevin had said, which is a conversation we've had internally in different ways. But just to build on that, the total allocation matters, as much as, nearly as much as, maybe more than the distribution. Point is, they both really matter. Just, to take a commonly used example, if you were the city of Beverly Hills, which had a total regional housing need allocation of 3 units over 8 years in its previous, its fifth cycle RENA housing element, then you could put every one of those in the highest income neighborhood in the city, and you would still not be meaningfully improving the fair housing conditions in that city. It's just not enough to move the needle. And so you have to have both plans for a lot of housing to be built and to have those things distributed in a more equitable way. As Azine, you sort of brought up how we actually get there beyond the zoning, beyond identifying sites. And this might be an opportunity to talk about programs a little bit. And so maybe I don't have like a super specific way of asking this question, Pavo, but because you did all this analysis on the programs as well as the sites inventories, can you say a little bit about what's missing there in terms of, how cities are actually identifying how they're going to actually achieve the goals that are outlined in their plans?
Yeah. So we can put maybe in the chat a link to an older version of this analysis we did of AFFH programs in 8 cities, housing elements. But absolutely, the programs side of the AFFH requirement is as important. Well, maybe not as important, but it's important as as well as the sites inventory. And we did a review of what cities are doing and tried to categorize them as meaningful actions or somewhat meaningful actions or not very meaningful actions. So cities AFFH programs range from everything from graffiti removal in Culver City to streamlined affordable housing development on congregational sites, which is going to actually yield to some housing production. We saw, I think there were a lot of interesting programs, mostly geared, given it's an interesting thing because these are AFFH programs within the housing element, so they're more geared towards housing production, given the nature of the housing element. And this is something that we might see change next cycle as AFFH has become a more embedded part of the system. This cycle, it was fairly new to cities and kind of a little last minute. So what they did in terms of their programs may not be indicative of what it will become. but a lot of the programs were geared towards housing production and were rezonings or streamlining or incentive programs for housing development, in addition to kind of housing assistance type programs. But it's it's something that deserves attention. I will quickly mention. I looked at the questions in the chat. There was a question about validating the FLUS given the variety of contexts, and also a question about patterns. Kind of, did stereotypically NIMBY cities do worse than what cities we might consider to be progressive on this indicator? And that's something we're working on right now. We're going to hopefully have something soon on that, kind of analyzing the determinants of higher FLUS scores, and especially focused on kind of where did cities within their existing multifamily neighborhoods, where did cities choose to select sites for lower income housing development? I will pass the programs question to Zine and Kevin if you have thoughts.
I'll take a quick stab here, and I think it's another great question. When I was a planner and in the mayor's office, I often thought that, like, all right, well, what really matters here is our RENA and our sites inventory and the delta that's created, and that's was and the program stuff, that's all like really nice fluffy stuff that you kind of put out there, and maybe you'll do it, maybe you won't, and there's no real kind of accountability mechanism for any of these issues. So I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I think that I guess to kind of get to the point of this webinar, I do think things like the FLUS kind of uh, help us take that next step, right? Because we do need some kind of measure of evaluation. Well, is this policy or program going to help us achieve these goals, or is this policy or this program going to help us achieve these goals? You touched on it in your presentation, Pavo, but rezoning land owned by faith-based organizations, ends up having this kind of really negative plus score, because a lot of those organizations or institutions may be concentrated in lower resource areas or something like that. And so we look at this wide range of policies and programs. We can try to supercharge adaptive reuse. We can open up more faith-based land or publicly owned land. How are these things going to help us? And I think we do need some kind of standardized way to assess some of these issues. But I do really think, to echo Shane's point, that like that RENA, that sites inventory, that delta, those are the things that really push us, right, to think more critically. And I agree with one of the comments in the Q&A that some of the big numbers can be a little fantastic, right? And that we're certainly not going to achieve them through 2029. But it's these kinds of big things that push municipalities and push us to have to think critically about where are we allowing housing, where are we pushing zoning reforms, what kinds of incentives can we use to actually get the housing built and to the next step, because without that push, a lot of these municipalities just wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I'd echo Azine in some regard, but also stress really the importance of supportive policy and supportive financing, and funding mechanisms too. I would be interested to see what FLUS scores may look like for realized or newly constructed housing, if you have point-based layers. I would imagine that perhaps they would be even further skewed toward the negative side, simply due to the challenges of site assembly, neighborhood opposition, and things like that in a lot of instances. And Shane, you mentioned an interesting, we have talked about, I think, Beverly Hills a heck of a lot here, but I think there's a clear reason for that, because a lot of the kind of the wealthier, more single family enclave local jurisdictions do tend to be a lot further out. They tend to be further for, the Palos Verdes Peninsula, Pavo, you mentioned, very far from a freeway connection and jobs and transit access, or up in, hilly areas. You can sort and you do a control F for hills or beach in a list of cities, and oftentimes that will tell you where the higher income ones are. But they're often subject to a lot more environmental risk as well. Beverly Hills is an interesting difference in here, where it is typically characteristically wealthier, characteristically a little bit more single family, although actually the majority of its units are multifamily. But it happens to be high accessibility and well transit served. So some of those other infill oriented potentials. So that's, I think, going to become a concern, is when you think of the transportation objectives and the climate risk, whether it be say wildfire or coastal inundation, or even the additional vehicle miles traveled induced from higher density kind of up in hill country, for example. So a lot of things to consider on a map, but frankly, it's one piece of the puzzle. But certainly applaud the improvements and the measure, and I would love to see some regional or sub-regional analogs of that as we look to seventh cycle RENA allocation methodologies. Fortunately, we have a little bit more time in advance to think through that.
That is a great transition, Kevin. I'm going to ask Pavo and Azine just very quickly to share what they are looking for, what they're thinking about as we start to think about the policy making for the seventh cycle. It doesn't feel like it's too close, and yet we really need to start making the laws around it right now. I do want to just say really quickly, I'm going to share one more link here in response to Michael Barnes's comment about the RENA numbers being, as Azine put it, pretty fantastic, as Michael put it, pure fantasy. I think there's some truth to that. And Pavo, along with Nick Morantz and Chris Elmendorf, wrote about that and other issues in the process, and I've shared the link to that. But let me turn it over to you, Pavo and Azine, to add your own thoughts on the seventh cycle, just about a minute each, if you could.
Sure. Yeah, I hope that HCD gets more rigorous in its reviews of housing elements, and in order to do that, provides more clarity about what constitutes a good housing element. And we've written this in other places, and I've told them this, be more prescriptive. We recognize that cities are different in many ways. However, I think HCD could be more prescriptive in terms of what it wants to see in terms of AFH programs or sites analysis, and then make the process easier for everybody by expecting a high standard that's going to achieve the goals, but being clear about what that is. And I hope that would require a few different reforms to make it happen.
Yeah, very quickly, I would be remiss if I didn't say that, largely based on Pavo and Aaron's research, Abundant Housing LA is sponsoring a bill in the legislature this year to strengthen AFFH and hopefully empower and authorize HCD to provide greater clarity and standards, hopefully with some greater accountability mechanisms for AFFH programs and policies as well. And I do think another element is, there were some great successes that came out of the sixth cycle. I would say, one of those in particular is the city of LA's a pretty forward-thinking, sites inventory, kind of really bringing an extra level of analysis to determine, well, what is the likelihood of any given, site to be redeveloped into housing. So I think looking into the seventh cycle, maybe there's a possibility to take some of the best elements of the sixth cycle housing elements and really, write them into what we're requiring of cities all over the state.
Great. Well, I want to thank our guests, Kevin and Azine, for joining us today, the whole Lewis Center team, including Pavo, Whitney, Phoebe, and Aaron, for playing a really key role in this research, and our funders, Wells Fargo Foundation and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and finally, all of our attendees for being here today. And we'll see you at the next webinar or Lewis Center event. Thanks.
And I guess, sorry, I'll just close by saying thanks also. And if you have specific questions or you want follow-up, just email me.
Perfect. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.